Hey folks, how's it going? Thank you for checking out the video. I'm Johnny, and today I'm going to show you 3 ways you can create dynamic measures. Then I'm going to show you my ultimate dynamic measures method. Today's going to be a long one, but stick around, I promise it's worth it. Today's video is inspired by a recent Workout Wednesday challenge. Now, if you haven't heard of Workout Wednesday, it was originally set up by Tabular users, but since 2021, a group from the Power BI community have started to set a weekly challenge. Challenges involve being given a data set and a data visualization challenge. If you're new to Power BI, it's a great way to learn it. If you're a seasoned pro, you might be surprised what you can learn. Certainly in my first few weeks of doing the challenges, it exposed me to features and techniques within Power BI that I hadn't previously used. And even if you really are a Power BI master, the challenges give you access to some really interesting data sets and give you the opportunity to showcase what you can do with Power BI, maybe the opportunity to build a bit of a portfolio. Today's video is specifically related to the Week 8 challenge, which was set by Spencer Bowkey. Let's take a look at that report. So the data set for the report is NCAA financials data. That's the National Collegiate Athletics Association. They administer sports programs in American colleges. When I talk about a dynamic measure, this is what I mean. It's the ability to change the contents of a measure by selecting from the slicer. They're a really good way of saving space on a report, and it is a requirement that I have seen a lot out in the wild. Let's take a look at my version of the same report, and I'll show you how Spencer's solution works. Now, for the sake of demonstration, I haven't tried to totally recreate the formatting of Spencer's report, but functionally, this does exactly the same. There are 2 things that you need to create for this solution. Disconnected table that contains a list of the measures you want to select from, and then the measure itself. In the original solution, that disconnected table was done using the enter data option. I've decided to use a calculated table in DAX. I've called my table @dynamic measure. I like to prefix my disconnected tables so that I can tell them apart from the tables in the rest of my data model. The table has 2 columns. Measure selection, which gives the list of measures we're going to select from, and then sort order. The sort order is there because as part of the Workout Wednesday challenge, one of the requirements was the ability to sort the list of measures in a specific way. We want revenue to appear first because that's the most important measure. Now here's the DAX for my measure. We have a variable which returns which measure has been selected from my dynamic measure table. Then we have the switch statement. If the selection returns total revenues, then use the total revenues measure. If it returns total expenses, use the total expenses measure, and so on. Nothing is selected, default to blank. And this all works as required. Personally, I've used this exact technique to fulfill this requirement in the past. However, it does have a drawback. Let's go back to my report. Now you can see I've added 2 additional measures. We have profit percentage, so that we can show our profits as a percentage of our total revenues as opposed to the absolute amount. And I've also added the count of schools, so we can see for each conference how many schools there are. Profit percentage should be displayed as a percentage, and the count of schools is a whole number. Let's see what happens when we select them. So for profit percentage, we're now getting this wacky decimal figure that's got a currency symbol in front of it. And similarly, if I go to count schools, which should be an integer, should be a whole number, that's shown as currency as well. I can demonstrate this more explicitly if we put this into a matrix. So as you can see here, our first 3 measures, which are supposed to be returned as currency, do so. But profit percentage and count of schools are also being formatted as currency. Using this technique, you can only have one format specified. There is a second technique I've used in the past that can solve this. If we go over to my dynamic measures table now, I've added this new measure, dynamic measure formatted. Let's have a look at the DAX. It's similar to our existing dynamic measure, except this time I've wrapped each of our statements in a format function. So when we return total revenues, we will use this format string. When we use profit percentage, we'll use this format string. And for counter schools, we'll use this format string. Drag that measure onto our matrix and see what happens. Brilliant. So this now looks like exactly what we need. We've got currencies for our first three measures. Profit percentage has been returned as a percentage. Counter schools is now a whole number. Let's go back to our first page, and I can now add this new measure to my visuals. So first I'm going to select this bar chart, open the visualizations pane, remove dynamic measure, let's add dynamic measure formatted. That's weird, it won't stick. That's because we're now formatting the measure as text. You can't aggregate text values, so you can't add them to something like a graph because it doesn't know how to add the numbers up. There's one other problem with using this method as well. If we go back to page 2 of my report, I've added a table. I've got the conferences in the first column and I've got my dynamic measure in the right hand column. I've set a filter on this table so it's just returning the count of schools. Now if I sort this column, I get some strange results in my sorting. It seems to think that 4 is a higher number than 21 or 17 or 15. That's because, once again, this is text. Now sorting those values alphabetically as opposed to via the number value. So this second dynamic measure technique is also flawed. But there is a third way, and that's to use a calculation group. Now when I first saw this challenge set on Workout Wednesday, doing it using a calculation group is the technique that first sprang to mind. Calculation groups are relatively new to Power BI. You can't add them natively to a data model using Power BI Desktop. You have to use a third-party tool, Tabular Editor. Let's go back to my report. I'm going to delete my dynamic measure table. Which now breaks all my visuals. Let's go to the external tools ribbon and launch Tabular Editor. To add a calculation group, let's go across to tables. Right click, create new, and select calculation group. I'm going to call that calculation group at dynamic measure to match my original table. If we expand our calculation group, we'll see a few options. Calculation items is where we'll add our dynamic measure DAX. Name is the column that will contain our list of measure names. Let's rename that to measure selection. We'll come to ordinal in a moment. Now let's add our dynamic measure to this table. I'm going to set a default value for this measure of blank. To add items to our calculation group, let's come across to calculation items. Right click and select new calculation item. Let's call this one total revenues. To add our DAX to the calculation item, we need to come across to the expression editor over here. The DAX we want is that if the total revenue calculation item is selected, we want to return the total revenues measure. Now you can type that in here if you want. What you can do is come across to your measure in the model pane and drag it across. Let's do that for our other 4 measures. With that done, we need to click the Save button. And then we can exit Tabular Editor and go back to our report. You'll be prompted with this Refresh Now option to process the changes made in Tabular Editor. Because we use the same naming conventions in our calculation group as we did in our original dynamic measure table, our visuals have all fixed themselves automatically. So that seems to have worked, but there's a few things that we can notice. First of all, we've lost our sort order. Total revenues is no longer the first listed measure. This is now just sorting alphabetically. If we click through the measures, count of schools is now shown as an integer, which is good. Profit percentage is still shown as this strange decimal number. Total expenses seems to have lost its currency, as does total profits and total revenues. So our formatting is still not sorted. We also get one more strange behaviour. Let me show you. I now add a card to my report, and I'm going to add to that card my total revenues measure. So we can see our dynamic measure here is showing 78, rounded up to 79 billion. Our actual total revenues measure is also showing 79 billion. If I now select one of my other measures, that total revenues measure also changes. That's because by default, selecting from our calculation group affects all measures, not just the dynamic measure we wanted it to. Now we can fix all three of these issues if we head back into Tabular Editor. First, let's sort out that sort order. The sort order is actually controlled by this ordinal field. However, you don't actually set the property using ordinal. What you need to do is select your actual calculation item. We go across to our properties pane. We'll see the ordinal property here. I want total revenues to appear first. Change this to a 1. And automatically it jumps to its alphabetical order number. That's okay, I can just change it again and this time it'll stick. Now if we go back to my calculation items, we'll see that total revenues has now jumped up to second in the queue, not first. That's because the ordinal actually starts from 0. So if I want total revenues to be top of the pile, 0 is the correct value to specify. Let's change that now. That's better, it's now top of the pile. Now what you can do, rather than setting the property in the properties pane, you can actually drag and drop the calculation items to set that ordinal. This is now the correct order we need to display. Next, let's fix the problem whereby our calculation group is affecting all measures. What we need to do is specify our DAX as follows. Here we're wrapping the DAX in an if statement. This is saying we should only apply our calculation group context if the measure being used is the dynamic measure. The last thing we want to do is fix the formatting of our measures. To do this, we come to this drop down and we select the format string expression. Here we add a similar DAX expression, this time specifying what format the measure should be returned. In this example, for our total revenues calculation item, it's saying that if the selected measure is the dynamic measure, format it as a currency, otherwise just return the formatting of the underlying existing measure. I've applied those changes across all 5 of my calculation items now. Let's save that and see how it's affected our report. And there you go, our sort order is now restored. If I click total expenses, my total revenues measure stays as it should. Same with total profits, and the total percentage is now being displayed as a percentage. Count of schools is now being displayed as an integer. Now this is where it starts getting interesting. Spending all that time in Tabular Editor got me thinking. External tools for Power BI is pretty new. In fact, it's only just come out of public preview, so Tabular Editor is still pretty new for Power BI developers. However, If you come from an analysis services background like me, you might be more familiar with it. I've been using Tabular Editor for around 4 years now. One of the things it's great for is for creating scripts. So if you've got a task you need to repeat, you can automate it. Would it be possible for me to create a script for this calculation group method? So, my usual method for tabular model scripts is to go on the internet, find somebody who's already written the script and steal it. Sometimes I might need to make some alterations to that script, but 90% of the work will already be done. So I searched high and low for somebody who was creating calculation groups using Tabular Editor scripts, and I drew a blank. Couldn't find anything anywhere. But the documentation for tabular models seemed to say that all the right classes and objects were available for a script to be able to call. So I did something I've never attempted before. I tried to write my own script by myself from scratch. And it works. Let's head over to Tabular Editor and check it out. First of all, if we head over to the model pane, you can see that I've deleted the calculation group that we created before. Over on the right hand side, I've selected the advanced scripting pane, and here's my script. Now I won't walk you through the entire thing, but in these first few rows, we can set these variables so that we can set the naming conventions for our calculation group. To run the script, come over to our measures, select the measures we want to have in our calculation group, then head on over to the scripting pane and select run. Back over in the model pane, you can see our dynamic measures now appeared. Let's expand that. Now the only thing this script doesn't achieve is setting the ordinal so that we've got our calculation items in the right order. Let's set that now. Let's save our changes and head back to our report. And it's worked. We've created our calculation group automatically using a script, and our report continues to work as we want it to. So at this point, I'm feeling pretty smug. Now, let's revisit the original challenge. There's one more feature that I need to add. Spencer's report also included these time intelligence measures showing current year, previous year, and year-on-year variance. Let's add those to our report now. So, I've added my measures to this time-based measures folder over here. Have a quick look at the DAX. Now the data set for this report was based on yearly values, so there isn't a regular calendar table in there where we can do time intelligence based on a date. It's just done by year. So I apologise for this slightly janky DAX that doesn't use the regular out-of-the-box time intelligence functions. What we can see is that we are referencing our dynamic measure here. Our other two time-based measures reference that dynamic measure in a similar way. Let's add them to the report. And it doesn't work. Why doesn't it work? Well, remember when we set up our calculation items, we wrapped our DAX in that if statement that said, if selected measure, do this, otherwise ignore it. Well, as soon as we start to try and reference our dynamic measure within a new measure, it no longer is the selected measure. When the DAX for the current year measure executes, the selected measure isn't dynamic measure. Therefore, it doesn't work and it reverts to what our dynamic measure default was, which was blank. So it turns out, in order to satisfy this requirement, the method that Spencer used at the very beginning was the correct method. He didn't need to have dynamically switching formats. All of his measures were in currency. The moral to the story here is that when there are multiple ways to achieve something, you need to understand all of those ways in depth, what their pros and what their cons are, and make sure that you select the method that's best suited for your requirement. I am still not done, because now I'm going to show you my ultimate dynamic measure method. Having gotten the Tabular Editor scripting bug, I set about turning about my script into being the very best it could be. Here's what I came up with. So, back in Tabular Editor, you can see once again, I've deleted my calculation group. The calculation group's no longer there. Over on the right hand side, I've selected the advanced scripting option. Let's open and import my script. To run the script, select the measures that we want to be included in the calculation group, hit run. Once again, our dynamic measure calculation group has now magically appeared. We still need to set the calculation item order though for the ordinal. Let's save that again and head back to our report. So, to the naked eye, nothing's really changed, but if I look over in my fields and look at my dynamic measures, you'll see I now have some additional options. Let's explore those further by looking at our matrix. Here you can see our original dynamic measure still behaving as expected. What happens if we add dynamic measure switch to the matrix? As you might expect, this now returns a version of the measure that's the way we did this in our first method. And if we add dynamic measure formatted, that returns the measure using the technique we used for our second method. Lastly, I have a blank card here at the top of my screen. Let's add to that this display selected dynamic measures measure. What that does is return a concatenated list of which dynamic measures are currently being selected. I can demonstrate that using the slicer here. Now, making all three methods available to you gives you the flexibility to pick the one that best suits your needs. Let's go back to our first page on the report and check it out. So as you can see, I've now added the time intelligence measures back onto the report. The way I've been able to do this, my current year measure references the formatted version of my dynamic measure, as does previous year. To get the year on year variance, which has a fixed format of percentage, I use my switch measure. I've continued to use the calculation group version of the measure for all other parts of the report. And if I click between my measures now, you'll see that I get the correct formatting no matter which measure I pick. The last thing that my ultimate dynamic measure script has done is add some metadata onto the objects that have been created. So if I hover over my dynamic measure table, you'll see now I get a description. And I've added the same feature on these measures as well. It's pretty awesome, isn't it? Now I've made both the scripts that I've used today available on my GitHub page. I'll make sure that I put a link in the description, and then you can access the calculation group script and the ultimate dynamic measure script as well. Now I use C# to create Tabular Editor scripts, and it's fair to say that my C# is ropey. Both of these scripts do exactly what I want them to, and they seem to run quick enough. But if you're a scripting whiz, please do download these scripts and see if you can improve on them. Let's iterate and see if we can get an even better version out to the community. That was my ultimate guide to dynamic measures. It's been an epically long video today, so if you have stuck around to the end, thank you so much, I really do appreciate it. By the way, does it do that thing every time I say ultimate? I guess it does. If you do have any questions or feedback, please don't be afraid to slide into the comment section below. If you have enjoyed today's video, please do give it a thumbs up. And if you want to follow along for more content like this, please do subscribe to the channel. Thanks once again for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.